everybody caught up, whether you're old enough or you're not quite old enough to remember this all, and get re-educate you on all of those pieces in the big perspective. Our involvement in Vietnam begins in 1950. Most people don't realize that we were in Vietnam in the 1950. In 1950, Vietnam is a colony of France. When France withdrew their troops to the home front during World War II, they sent them back in after World War II to take it back as a colony, and the Vietnamese people tired very quickly of being a colony, and they threw the French out in a very bloody fashion. So in the 1950s, they're a country in search for a government. And if you remember back to world history, we know that there's really two primary forms of government in the 1950s. You could be a communist or socialist state like China and the Soviet Union wanted them to be, or you could be some sort of a representative democracy like we and our allies wanted them to be. So beginning in 1950, we send in our first advisor. And when I talk about advisors, I don't just mean military advisors, but you have to have a military to support a democracy. We send in police and judges to set up a judicial system. We send in teachers and educators to set up an education system. We send in nurses and doctors to set up a medical system, manufacturing experts, farmers to set up agricultural system, and road builders. We wanted that to be a young, thriving democracy, and so we sent all these advisors in to make that happen. Vietnam is a relatively peaceful place. There's not a lot of fighting going on, so there's not a lot of casualties that go with that. But that begins to change in the early 1960s. And in 1964, we have what is known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. We now know, 61 years later, the Gulf of Tonkin incident was probably some failure of the Navy radars on our ships. But they thought they saw fast attack boats coming out from Vietnam to attack them, and they didn't have the authority and ability to defend themselves. So they sent that information back to the Pentagon. They asked for the Pentagon for some clarification, and the Pentagon took that to Congress asking for a declaration of war. And Congress looked at that very same evidence and they said, you know what, Mr. Johnson, if you want to go off and have yourself a war, go right ahead. Just let us know how it goes. It's for this reason that for the next 40 years, this is often referred to as the Vietnam conflict. But I'll tell you, you can't send 3 million men and women into an area and it not be a war. You can't lose 58,000 Americans and it not be a war. You can't spend hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars and it not be a war. This is a war by every definition of the word war, but because we couldn't get those members of Congress to get off their butts and do the job they were supposed to do, this was often mislabeled as the Vietnam conflict. But this is the Vietnam War. And President Johnson has the ability to send in combat troops, and he sends in the first 3,500 combat troops in March of 1965. By the end of 1965, we have 180,000 troops on the ground. By the end of 1966, we have almost 300,000 troops on the ground. And as those troops were on the ground, as we began fighting, we started taking the casualties related to that. So much so that by the end of 1967, we had our 15,000th casualty. This war got very bloody very quickly, but the worst was yet to come. You see, 1968 is such a pivotal year. Not only do we fill up the board here, but we add a whole other banner out here that I'm going to encourage you to come back at. 1968 was an incredibly difficult time in our country's history as well as in Vietnam. And when I talk to people who weren't alive during 1968 or don't remember back to it, I often tell them to sit there and compare it with the year that we all recently went through, and that's 2020. Because I believe 1968 and 2020 are very similar in so many ways. See if you agree. 1968, like 2020, were both presidential election years. We had two candidates running for office who had different perspectives on where we were as a country and where we needed to go. 1968, like 2020, we had been involved in a war for over a decade. A war that we were trying to determine, did we need to get more involved in or did we need to withdraw our troops from? 1968, like 2020, we had protests in towns large and small from coast to coast on how we were going to deal with Black Americans. 1968 is the height of the Civil Rights Movement. 2020, we're trying to understand how we're fitting them into the judicial system. Our nation is at each other's throats here on the home front, and that continues in both of those years. Where 1968 differs from 2020 is that in 1968, y'all only had 2 or 3 television channels to watch. Everybody watched the same channels. And when you watched the news every single night, you saw this war unfold in your living room. You heard the bullets, you heard the explosions, you heard the cries of the men. You saw this war unfold in your living room, and when they ended the national news every single night, they told you how many Americans had been killed that day. When you turned on the local news, they gave you the names of the local men and women who had been killed from your community. This war unfolded in your living room. And as this war unfolded in your living room, it was the first time in over 100 years that a majority of Americans were against this war. 100 years before 1968, this was a civil war. It makes sense that the majority of Americans were against the civil war. We were fighting with each other, but the majority of Americans were against this war. And those Americans that were flags and flowers. Instead, they would be there at the airport and yell at them, call them names, spit on them, not give them chairs. Those veterans were treated horribly beginning in this war, and that would continue on for several decades. The veterans were told to come back and take your uniforms off, throw them away. Don't tell prospective employers or your families where you served, what you were doing. Even if you hadn't been in Vietnam, our nation turned their backs on them and ostracized them and wouldn't hire them. And that would continue on. If you were watching the television on January 31st of 1968, you heard Walter Cronkite, the #1 most trusted news and source of news, sit there and broadcast live from Vietnam. He was broadcasting live from the first day of what became known as the Tet Offensive. And he proclaimed on the news that night, as far as this reporter sees it, this war is lost. He was broadcasting live from the first day of the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was an initiative by the North Vietnamese and their allies to hit us everywhere. From the north to the south, from the highlands down to the beaches, they figured if they hit us in every outpost, every base, everywhere in the country, they could roll over us. They would inflict so many casualties, we'd have so many flag draped coffins that would come back, but we, like the French before us, would leave and they could have their country back. They hit us everywhere. January 31st was the deadliest day of the war. We lost 246 Americans in one day. May of 1968, as we won those back, became the deadliest month. 1968 in its entirety was the deadliest year. But by the time 1968 ended, we hadn't lost our will to be there. We hadn't lost our desire. When Nixon is elected in November of 1968 and sworn in 1969, he actually expands the war, expands the troop presence, expands the countries we're fighting, expands the bombing. And that continues on throughout 69 and 70, on into 71. And it isn't until he's running for re-election in 1972 that they remind him, hey, by the way, Mr. President, you were going to get us out of this war. So he bombs the North Vietnamese back to the negotiation table in the fall of 1972. And in February of 1973, we enter what is known as the Paris Peace Accords. I want you to listen to this and compare it to a war we were in recently. The Paris Peace Accords required that we removed all of our combat troops out of Vietnam, but we left thousands of troops behind to help the South Vietnamese. We took all of our combat troops out in March of 1973, but thousands remained behind to help the South Vietnamese in their war. And those troops remained behind throughout the remainder of 73 into 74. And in May of 1975, we have what is known as the Mayaguez incident. The USS Mayaguez was a civilian merchant ship. We had some American sailors on board her. The North Vietnamese allies boarded that ship, took those Americans to shore, and we sent in a rescue unit to go in and rescue those Americans. And during that rescue, we lost 21 Americans in one single day. President Ford sat there and said, wait a second, for the last 25 years, we've been fighting in this war to bring them democracy, and they are no closer today than they were in 1950. But they will no longer have the Americans on which to rely. And he took the last Americans out of Vietnam in May of 1975, and only weeks later, Vietnam falls. Guys, that's your Vietnam 201 college course. You can go get your credits in the administrative building. You don't have to take any finals or no projects. You're all set. But I want you to walk out with 3 pieces of information. First off, I want you to realize this is the longest war in our nation's history. This is a 25-year war. It was only eclipsed in the final months of Afghanistan. And secondly, this was a war that we as a nation wanted to forget. If you're one of those protesters who didn't support this war, you didn't want to think back to those 25 years. If you're one of those veterans who came back and took your uniform off, threw it away, and didn't admit to anybody that you had served, you didn't want to think back to these 25 years. This is the first time that we as a nation had entered an international conflict and get our will on the world stage. Now, I don't want you to write a nasty letter to my boss and say, hey, tell me I'm not saying we went in there to bring democracy to South Vietnam. And South Vietnam is still not a democracy to this day. And in our 200-year history, we didn't do this. So it's very interesting that only 4 years after the close of our troops in Vietnam in 1979, our founders touched a movie called The Deer Hunter. The Deer Hunter does a horrible job portraying what Vietnam veterans were like. Horrible job. And they said, that's not who we fought with. That's not who we are. That's not what we're about. And you know what this nation needs? We need to have a memorial on the national mall that's going to magically heal it. Now, this is a crazy idea. First off, that a civil memorial is going to heal 25 years of conflict. Secondly, we don't have any memorials on the national mall to any other wartime periods at this point. It was the first of its kind. But we were we created our organization as a nonprofit in 1979, and in 1980 we went to Congress and asked for 3 acres of land on the national mall. Congress passed it unanimously. Hampshire. We polished it up. We took it down to Tennessee. We were ready to hire 100 engravers. We asked them how long it was going to take to put 58,281 names on it. You know what they told us? 90 years. We said we don't have that time. So we came up with a brand new process by which we used a sandblasting etching technique that we sandblasted the names on there in such perfection that it's within 1/1000th of an inch. And we did it with a bunch of college students in one summer. 1/1000th of an inch, guys. Scotch tape is 6/1000ths of an inch thick. That's how perfect that engraving was done. So from the idea in 1979 to the passage of legislation to the fundraising and the design and the construction was only 3 years. Nothing happens in Washington, D.C. in 3 years, guys. That's the magic behind this memorial. Let's come on down here and continue our tour. Million visitors. But when we surveyed those visitors, over half of those visitors were not alive in 1982 when we built the memorial. They weren't alive. So when they see a name on the memorial, they don't see the name of a family member that they had a Christmas with. They don't see the name of a classmate or a battle buddy. They just see a name. So beginning in 2001, we began an effort to find a photograph for every single one of the 58,281 men and women on the wall. And with the help of hundreds of volunteers throughout the United States, we now have a photograph for every single one. And because of that, we're able to show you this Hometown Hero screen. This is the 278 men who used Hawaii as their home of record in their military documents. And you can see their names, you can see their home of record, you can see their branch of service and their rank and their date of birth and their date of casualty, where you can find them on the wall. But more importantly, you can see their pictures. You can see their pictures as they go through those milestones of high school graduations and college graduations, boot camp graduations. You can realize that these men took their lives, stood up and said, I will defend the freedoms of the world, and went off and paid for it with their lives. Now, if you compare those pictures with the pictures on this screen, you'll see some folks on this screen with some younger photos, but oftentimes you'll see photos with guys with white hair or no hair at all. They're at different stages of their life. These are the 55 men and women from the state of Hawaii, the Vietnam veterans who came back and later died. We know now that the Vietnam veterans are like many of their other veterans in that unfortunately some would come back and commit suicide. Others would come down with diseases that at first we couldn't understand why. But in the 1980s and 1990s, we started realizing it was because of their exposure to a chemical known as Agent Orange. Agent Orange is a dioxin. It is a chemical that we used on the grasses and trees and shrubs to make them die off. So we had a defensible perimeter around all of our bases. It's incredibly effective as that tool and for that recess. But it would make these men and women incredibly sick. And as they started dying of cancers and heart conditions, as they started getting sick, and as their families members lost them, they sat there and they said, Vietnam took them from us. It just took 20 or 30 or 40 years. They deserve to be on the wall. We don't have room on the wall for the 3 million men and women whose lives will be shortened. So the VA tells us that the Vietnam veterans who served in the country have lives that are 6 to 7 years shorter than their peers that weren't there. But in 1999, we began a program called the In Memory Program. And it's an opportunity to family and friends of those who have died since their service to be honored there at the wall in Washington, D.C. I want you to raise your hands if you know someone who was a Vietnam veteran who came home forever changed by their experience there. And I want you to keep your hand raised if they're no longer with us. If your hand is raised and they're no longer with us and they're from Hawaii, I'm going to give you homework. I gave you free college credit earlier. I'm going to give you homework now. I want you to go get a brochure over in the information tin or at the in-memory plaque. And I want you to get it in the hands of the family and friends of those folks. Because to honor them is simple, but we need 3 pieces of information. First off, we need to have a death certificate that shows that they died. It doesn't have to be service-connected or anything else. It's merely to show that they died. Secondly, we need to have a DD-214 that shows us that they served during the wartime period in the war zone. And third, we need to have pictures. Because we're going to build a web page for each of them like we have a web page for everyone on the wall. And then when we come into their home state, we're going to have their picture up on their home state board to honor and remember them. The biggest ceremony that we hold every year at the wall in Washington, D.C. is not Memorial Day. It's not Veterans Day. The biggest ceremony that we hold at the wall in Washington, D.C. is on Father's Day weekend. It's when over 2,000 family and friends of those inductees from that year come to the wall in Washington, D.C. We don't get a general or politician to get up on stage. Those families go up on stage one after another and read off the names of their loved one, their friends, and induct them into that honor roll. So help me in getting that word out there so we can honor these men and women who ultimately will be taken from us because of their service in Vietnam. Let's continue our tour down here. We had construction barricades up around it to keep it safe while it was under construction. And we had a gentleman walk down to the foreman one day with a Purple Heart medal in his hands. And he walked up and gave it to the foreman and he said, "Here, I want you to take this. We received this medal when my brother was shot down in Vietnam. And if you put it there in the wet concrete foundation, it'll be with my brother forever, and he deserves to have it more than I." It was the first item left behind at the wall. But if you look back at the pictures from the dedication of the wall in November of 1982, one of the most iconic pictures that I've ever seen is a pair of black cowboy boots left at the base of one of the panels. Those boots don't have a note with them on who they were left for or who they were left by. But any single one of us who knows someone who's known for their black cowboy boots can recognize that there on that panel was somebody who was known for those black cowboy boots. At the end of every day, we'd gather those items that had been left behind and put them in these blue tubs. We put the blue tubs into a mower shed because we didn't think it was going to last very long. But as those blue tubs started overwhelming that mower shed, the bosses came along and said, "What's all this junk?" And they said, "Boss, we don't think it's junk." And they agreed. They gave us a bigger shed. We filled it up. Then they gave us the basement of the Lincoln Memorial. You all know how tall the top of the Lincoln Memorial is? There's a vault underneath it twice the size. We filled it up. They built us a warehouse outside of Washington, D.C. on a football field. And they put in aisle after aisle, row after row, floor to ceiling of these racks. And in the last 42 years, we've now filled up that warehouse with over 400,000 items that have been left behind. Those items that visitors to the wall have said, "This is how I want them to be remembered." Because of our association with the wall in Washington, D.C. and our partnership with the National Park Service, we can come and bring these representative examples of some of these items. You couldn't see these if you were at Washington, D.C. You couldn't see these anywhere else. And you can see through these how our nation has wanted to honor them. Now, the items in this cabinet help us understand a little bit about what service was like in Vietnam. Can I have my Vietnam and Vietnam era veterans please raise your hands? Thank you for your service. Welcome home. I guarantee you if I brought those veterans down here and we talked about their service, even if they had been in the same unit at the same time on the same base, their recollections are going to be different. Because your recollections and your life experiences are as much as what goes into that moment as what happens in that moment. But if I brought them down here and we talked about the sound of a Huey helicopter and how beautiful that sound was as it came through the morning fog, because you knew it was going to take your battle buddy who was wounded beside you all night. You knew it was going to resupply you with more weapons, more ammunition, more reinforcements. You knew it was going to bring your mail. You're going to have that special sound, that special feeling that they'll tell you about. If you talk to those Army veterans that can identify with this uniform from the mid-1960s, they'll sit there and tell you how that bug juice that was in that band on the top of that steel pod helmet was sometimes so effective at keeping bugs off, and other times seemed to burn your skin, and other times seemed to attract more bugs than you would have ever had you never put it on. If you sat there and talked to them about these pictures in the background, they'd tell you stories that you might never have heard. I'm going to encourage you that if you're here with the Vietnam or Vietnam era veteran, you come back and look at these and hear the stories that are beget by these items, because they may be stories that you have never heard before in your life. Let's come over to the other side and continue our tour. The most common item left behind at the wall in Washington, D.C. are flowers and notes and cards. But the next most common item left behind are these POW MIA bracelets. You see, POW MIA bracelets are an advent of the Vietnam War. POW MIA bracelets are a project that was put together in Southern California by some members of the League of Families of POWs and MIAs and some college students. They realized that majority of Americans were against this war, but they wanted to create something that you could wear to show your solidarity with those who were serving. And so they came up with these aluminum bands. The idea behind it was that you would send $2 or $3 off in the mail. And a couple weeks later, you'd get an envelope back, and in it would be this aluminum band. That band always had a name on it. Sometimes it had a rank, sometimes it had a branch of service, sometimes it had a country, but the other thing that it had on it was a date. That was a date that the man had gone missing. In buying one of those bracelets, you promised that you would wear it every single day. You would say prayers for their safe return. You'd read the newspaper or Life magazine. You'd watch the news. And when they returned, it was your obligation to seek them out and hand them their bracelet and say, "Thank you for your service. Welcome home." But at the end of the war, there were still almost 2,000 Americans missing. Now having one of these bands took on a new meaning. Now you would read the newspapers. Now you would go online. Now you would watch the news and hope for a repatriation, a return of their remains so their families could have the closure. And when they were returned, you would take that POW band and take it to where they were buried or bring it to the wall in Washington, D.C. It's for this reason that we have thousands of these bracelets that have been left behind. in as much as there is a story about the name that's on the bracelet, there's often some incredible stories about the bracelet. One of the most interesting items that I've seen left behind in the last decade was a bracelet that had a note attached to it. A note that said, as long as I can remember holding my mother's hand, she was wearing this bracelet. I learned about the war through this bracelet. We said prayers for you every night. And when the war ended and you hadn't returned, our prayers changed. We buried Mom this week at Arlington National Cemetery. And we thought that this was a fitting place to come and leave this bracelet. We hope that someday your family can have the closure and a place to mourn your loss that we now have for our mother. It's for this reason that these bracelets were made for the wars after that. It's this reason these bracelets are still worn to this day. And they're an iconic symbol of the Vietnam War. Now I want my veterans of any era, I want my veterans to tell me what was the best thing that you ever got in your care packages. So veterans and active duty service members, no matter what era, tell me what your best thing in your care packages were. Are you a veteran or active duty? What's your best thing in your care package?
Chocolate.
Chocolate? Like hard chocolate kind of thing? Chocolate bars?
Anything sweet.
Anything sweet. All right, veteran? Ma'am? I'm going to get to him. Yes, sir?
Local food coming in.
Local food, Hawaiian food. You guys are special about your local food. All right. Guys in the back?
Letter.
Letter. Letter from whom? Okay. You're not going to give in on who was writing the letter, right? Okay.
Everybody.
All right, everybody. What you got, sir? Favorite thing in your care packages?
Banana sausage.
Banana sausage? Oh, Vienna sausage. Okay, all right. I was going to say, I've never heard of that. Banana sausage. All right. Are you a veteran back there, sir? Sir, are you a veteran back there? Yes, you're. Yep, you. Yep. Are you a veteran? What was your favorite thing in your care packages? Letters. Okay, perfect. Sir, are you a veteran? Ma'am? Sir, are you a veteran? Yep, you got the cap on. What's your favorite thing in your care package? Letters from your family. Ma'am, are you a veteran? Sir? Kool-Aid. All right, fantastic. Veterans? Veterans here. Veterans. Sir, are you a veteran? What's your favorite thing from your care package? Letters from home. All right, perfect. Sir? Pictures. Of whom? Of home. All right, perfect. Yes, sir.
All
right, fantastic. I only hear that in Hawaii. What you got? No? Veterans, guys? Yes, sir.
Letters.
Letters? All right. Either of you veterans back there? Okay. Veterans here? No? Veterans? Veterans. Yes, sir.
Baby water and toilet paper.
Yeah, you're a new era veteran. You're a desert veteran. Absolutely. Are you a veteran back here, sir? Behind you, you got a cap on. What was your favorite thing in your care packages? Letters. All right, fantastic. We got a lot of letter writers here. All right. Are you a veteran?
Yes.
What's your favorite thing in your care packages?
Letters from my son.
Letters from your son. Absolutely fantastic. Did I miss any veterans here in the middle? Are you a veteran, sir? What was your favorite thing?
Brownies.
Brownies. All right. Look at you, Mr. Fancy Pants. All right. No, veteran? What was your favorite thing in your care packages? Chocolate chip cookies from home, right? All right. What you got?
Oh, you're gonna like this.
I love it. Go for it.
I got a nice box that was crushed.
Okay. Of course.
It was Christmas of '68.
Yep.
And I opened it up, and it was toothpicks and styrofoam. Somebody had made me a nice Christmas tree of toothpicks and styrofoam.
Guys, as you can see, no matter when you serve, no matter where you serve, care packages are the best. Care packages are your family and friends sending you things from home that they know will brighten your day, make your life easier, and things that you want or things that you absolutely need. Half the times the cookies were in 16 million pieces. I don't know how your chocolate wasn't melted or anything else. As we already heard, the boxes got crushed and everything else, and you always had to share it with everybody who was around you, but care packages were the best. Here we have a care package. A care package that was mailed to Specialist 4th Class Charles Stewart in October of 1972. His parents received it back in early November of 1972, and on it was a piece of masking tape with a crayon marker that said KIA 103172. Charles Stewart wasn't alive when that care package arrived. His parents received that care package back before they received his body. And they put that care package on his casket for his funeral. And after they buried their son, they took that care package down into his bedroom. And they didn't go into his bedroom for 21 years. In 1993, their neighbor was coming down to the wall, and they asked Gary to bring it down to the wall, still unopened. And Gary thought to write a note on it. A note that reads, Charles Stewart, Mom and Dad want you to have these cookies and Kool-Aid. It's time they give these to you. They send all their love. Peace, Gary B. Whether you're one of those people who received a care package or someone who sent a care package, you can understand how difficult it would be if you knew that that last care package didn't arrive in time. And if you're one of those if you're a parent, you can sit there and understand how you might not be able to go into your child's room for 21 years as you grappled with their loss. Now here we have a 3-pack of Michelob. I understand times might be a little tough, but they're not tough enough that we're selling Michelob in 3-packs yet. But if you're going to buy yourself a 6-pack of Michelob, you're going to drink 3 yourself and you're going to leave 3 for your buddy. In this case, he left the 3 bottles with a bottle opener and some money with a note that said, "Here's the money that I owe you." Perfect. Perfect. Now the last item that we're going to look at in this cabinet is this baby sweater. This baby sweater that was left at the wall beneath the name of Donald Detmer in 1990. Donald Detmer was killed in 1967. His mom lived just outside of Washington, D.C., but she couldn't fathom to come to the wall for almost a decade. But in 1990, she brought that sweater down with a handwritten note. The note is written in cursive, and we realize most people don't know how to read cursive anymore, so we retyped it for you. It reads, "My dearest son, today I'm coming to see your name on the wall. I haven't been ready until now, but I knew that I must see it before I die. I miss you so much. I think of you every day. You had so much of life to live, and your life was taken so quickly. With a lump in my throat and teary eyes, I am on my way. I wanted to bring your teddy bear, but just couldn't part with it. Instead, I brought your first sweater. You're always in my heart. How I love you. God be with you. Until we meet again. Love, Mom." Every single parent can empathize with a mother who struggles on whether or not to bring a first item of clothing or a first toy. And every single child can wonder how your parents would honor you beneath a name on a national memorial. Let's come on down here and continue our tour. Ladies and gentlemen, when we were at the timeline the other side, we talked about how these Vietnam veterans were treated so horribly when they returned. We talked about how they were called names and how they were spit upon, how our nation turned our backs on them for decades. And so when our nation went off to the first major war after Vietnam in 1990, there was great concern that that was going to be repeated again with our service members. I was wearing the uniform at the time, and we had one of our commanding officers come into the barracks one day and say, "When you go on liberty this weekend, you don't have to wear your uniform." Now that was a weird command because we always had to wear a uniform when we were on liberty. But if you're going to tell me I can go out in my civilian clothes, I'm all happy to do that. Now you can take a military member out of their uniforms, but they still look like they're in the military. And when we were out in the community, we had people who were buying us drinks or giving us better seats, coming up and shaking our hands, and at first we couldn't understand what that was all about. But about the 3rd week that we were out, I had a gentleman who was about my father's age come up and tell me, he said, "Son, I want you to understand what's going on here." He said, "When we came back from Vietnam, this is how we were treated." And he went on to tell me a story that makes my skin crawl to this day. He said, "We made a promise amongst ourselves that another generation has to go off and fight in another war. Well, that's not going to be repeated. Yours is that generation, and this is that war." Now, I didn't have to deploy off to the Persian Gulf for the first Persian Gulf War, but for those hundreds of thousands of troops who did that, those Vietnam veterans were there to send them off. And they made certain at the end of that war in 1991, there was a homecoming parade on the National Mall to mark the end of that war. And when we needed to send our troops into Bosnia and Herzegovina, into Somalia, and all those minor skirmishes and wars that we had in the 1990s, those Vietnam veterans were joined by their immediate family members. And then after September 11th, our entire nation stood up. When we had to send off our National Guard units, our reserve units, our active duty units, we were there at the airport to send them off. We took care of their families while they were gone. And when they came home, no matter what time, day or night, we were there at the airport to welcome them home. Our nation had been transformed. Our nation had changed. We realized that we may not understand why we're getting involved in the country. We may not even understand where that country is on a map. But we realize that there's a difference between the war and the warrior. And we will never take our animosity or concerns about a war out on the warrior. That's the difference that we have today. That's what we deal with today in society. And now it's not surprising at all to see the smallest of children who would never go up to a stranger, walk up to a service member and shake their hands and say thank you for your service. That's the gift that the Vietnam generation gave us. That's the healing that began through this memorial. And that's the reality that we live with today. So it's fitting that we closed out our tour of items left behind at the wall with this pair of Desert Combat Boots. Desert Combat Boots that were left at the wall in 2008 by our Marine First Lieutenant. He leaves them with a note that reads, "Brothers, these are my lucky boots. They got me through 2 tours on the ground in Iraq. I figured you'd appreciate them more than the garbage man. The truth of the matter is, we owe you an awful lot. If your generation of Vietnam Marines had not come home to jeers, insults, and protests, my generation would not have come home to thanks, handshakes, and hugs." That's the transformation of our nation through this memorial and the items left behind. So it's time for us to come on down here and begin to learn about the memorial. To give us 3 acres of land on the National Mall. We went out and raised $8 million in 18 months. We decided we didn't want to hire one architect or one artist to come up with just one single design. We wanted to make it a contest. A contest open to anyone who was a United States citizen who was over the age of 18 who wanted to pay $20 to enter. Pretty awesome. You had to follow 4 simple rules. First, it had to be peaceful and contemplative. Second, it had to fit on the 3 acres we had been given. Third, it couldn't be for or against the war. And fourth, it had to list all 58,281 names of all the casualties. Except for that last rule, all pretty good rules. That last rule kind of makes it tough. We didn't think we'd get a lot of entries, and as the entries came in, we hit the names. We wanted it to be a blind contest. We started lining those entries up in a gymnasium. We quickly ran out of room. We went and got a bigger expo hall. We ran out of room there. So we called up the Air Force. We asked the Air Force, "Hey, you got a big place we can line these all up at?" You know what they gave us? They gave us the Air Force One hangar. You all know we park a 747 in that, right? We filled it up. We had 1,421 entries. We had 8 judges who were assigned the job of going through these entries. We didn't think anyone was going to have the perfect design. We were going to take the best parts of a couple designs and combine them together. Some of those judges were artists, architects, sculptors. A couple of them were veterans. They had that really tough job to do. They met on the beginning of the first day. They talked about what they were going to be looking for. They went out in that airplane hangar and started looking through all those 1,421 entries. They finished the first day. They went into the second day. They finished the second day. We started getting a little nervous. They met at the beginning of the third day. They went through the third day, and now we're starting to freak out. At the end of the 4th day, they called us in. They said, "We've all unanimously agreed on one design." Now, I guarantee you I could bring 8 of you guys down here. We could debate on where we want to go for lunch, and 8 of us couldn't agree upon where to go to lunch. And we don't have 1,421 options. 8 judges all unanimously agreed on one design. When they opened up the back of that design, they learned the designer's name is Maya Ying Lin. She was a 21-year-old student at Yale University. She hadn't even graduated college yet, much less designed anything in her life. We went back to the judges and we said, "Are you sure?" And they said, "Yep, that's the one." So we went up to Yale, asked her to skip out on school, and what kid doesn't want to skip out on school? She came on down and was showing off her model here at our press release, our meeting at the National Press Club to announce the winner of this contest. This is a picture from that announcement with a young 21-year-old Maya Lin with that big smile on her face. She had just won $20,000. We were going to build her memorial on the National Mall. This is our founder, Jan Scruggs, with his light blue suit with the wide lapels that was so in fashion in 1980. This is Bob Dubek with his skinny tie, our COO. You can see the excitement on our faces. You can see the happiness. We had the money. We had them planned. We had the design. We were ready to go. But as soon as we announced that was the winner, as soon as we announced that was what we were going to build, some of our best fundraisers, some of our best supporters, they started to attack it. They hated it. I think when we look back now, almost 45 years later, what they didn't like about it is it wasn't what they expected. Think back to war memorials before this. War memorials in your community generally are heroic statues. It's the warrior coming back from the battlefield. It's the Civil War general coming back on the horseback. It's the World War I doughboy with his flat helmet and his carbine coming back having freed Europe. There were no statues in this memorial, no heroes in a statuesque form. There wasn't an American flag. This memorial was black. They called it the Black Ash of Shame. This memorial was cut in the ground, and everything else in Washington, D.C. is tall and majestic. They said, "You're trying to bury us again. You're hiding us all over again." They attacked it and attacked it and attacked it, and when we wouldn't yield, they began to attack her. They called her a Vietnamese plant, a communist sympathizer, a Jane Fonda acolyte, and many terms much, much worse. Guys, Maya Lin was born in Ohio. Her parents had fled communism in China in the 1950s. They were university professors. There's no better American story than her heritage story. When they began to attack her, we realized we had to come to a compromise. We said, we know that you're going to love this memorial. We know that you're going to love it as it is, but we promise that we'll add some things. So 2 years after we dedicated the wall, we added the 3 servicemen statue. This is your hero statue. This depicts the primary races of men serving in uniform and equipment of the time. They're 110% of scale, so they would dwarf any of us standing here. That's your hero statue. Beside them, we put a 60-foot flagpole. At its base, there's the 5 service branch symbols of the 5 services that we're serving there. We figured we were done. But along come a group of people who said, wait a second, what about us? Who's that? The women, the women. There were 12,000 women serving amongst all the men. 97% of them were nurses. So this is sometimes errantly called the Nurses Memorial. But it is the Women's Memorial. It was dedicated in 1993 after the women got permission to add to the memorial. They added the Women's Memorial. Now it depicts 3 women. One on her knees with a helmet in her hands. One looking skyward, perhaps for a helicopter or divine inspiration. Another one taking care of a fallen service member. That's the Women's Memorial in honor of those 12,000 women. I'm going to let you in on 2 pieces of information so you can impress your friends and relatives and your tour guide when you go there. If you go look at the Women's Memorial, you're going to notice 3 things. First off, you're going to notice that this woman on her knees has a helmet in her hands. In the original artist proof, she had an infant in her hands. And they thought that was too controversial. And so they removed the infant and they put a helmet in her hands. Secondly, you're going to notice a new tradition that has sprung up in the last 7 years, and that is that we have started seeing hair bands there. When we've asked why they've been left behind, the nurses, modern day nurses and others, say, when you're a nurse, you always wear hair bands to put your hair back when you need to go into it. And they're leaving them there for their fellow nurses. And the last thing I want you to pay attention to when you go there is that you're going to see that there are these flower beds around the memorial. 8 flower beds in all, and there's 1 tree, 1 American basswood tree in each of those flower beds. There are 8 women on the wall, 8 flower beds, 8 trees surround the Women's Memorial. Now the last thing we added to the memorial in Washington, D.C. in 2004 was the in memory plaque. This was the plaque that was designed to honor those men and women who have come back and died since their service there. This is the program we talked about on the other side. And that out there is a full-scale replica of that plaque. So if I gave you homework on the other side, you can get a brochure there, and you can pay respects to those who came back and that in memory program there. In its entirety, this is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, but it leaves out one big thing, and that is the wall. So let's join together out there by that bench, and we'll start our tour of the wall. It would overwhelm you in size and number, and you couldn't help but feel buried and one amongst the dead. As you walked back out the other side and re-emerged into the light that is life, the names would recede back into the earth, forever separating life and death. That's the brilliance. That's what those 8 judges fell in love with. When you hear that, you understand why it had to be black. You understand why it had to be cut in the ground, why there wasn't a statue, why there wasn't a flag. So the last bit of criticism that we had to overcome was the criticism of how we were going to organize those 58,281 names. Because if you're going to sort 58,281 names, what's the best way to do it? Alphabetically. It's not a trick question at all. It's alphabetical. We should start with Gerald Adland over there. We should do David Zerwicki over here. We'd be all set. Anybody here want to admit you have the last name of Smith? I'll say it nicer than I usually say it. The Smiths ruined it for all of us. There are 668 surnames with Smith out there. Even if we put in first names, there's 18 Michael Smiths. Even if we put in middle initials, there's 3 Michael N. Smiths. If he's out there to look for his relative, how is he going to know which Michael N. Smith is his relative versus the 2 on the other side? He's not. Plus, if you're a Vietnam veteran and you want to walk amongst those who were there while you were there, you want to be with the ones who died while you were there, it would make sense if it's in chronological order. So once people realize it's not in alphabetical order, they go, oh gosh, it's got to be chronological. My second grade teacher told me I always read from left to right. So the first deaths are over there as the war builds up and the more casualties are here in the middle, and then the war tapers back down and the last deaths are over here. Well, that would be brilliant. But in this case, your teacher would be wrong. Because nobody wants to be the first death in a war. No one wants to be the last death in the war. Because if you're out there on the ends, it makes it seem like your sacrifice doesn't matter as much as those in the middle. So let's come on down to the middle and let's figure out how this is sorted. All right, guys, welcome to what is known as the apex of the wall, the apex. Of course, if you know vocabulary, you know apex is the term for the tallest point. If you're a math geek, apex is the term for the joining of two planes. This is the apex. Maya Lin knew the apex was special. She knew it would be the focal point. If you've ever been to the wall in Washington, D.C., you know that as you walk down from the end and walk down here to the apex, by the time you get to the apex, all the cacophony and madness that is Washington, D.C. has died down, and this is that quiet, solemn center. So Maya Lin centered the entire memorial here. And when they argued about where to put the three servicemen, there were a group of people who wanted to put the three servicemen statue right here. But Maya Lin and a few of the artists said, wait a second, if you put that here, that becomes the memorial, and this is nothing but a backdrop. And they put the three servicemen statue up on the hill, and it's perfect where it's at. And this remains that focal point. If you were with me since the beginning, you know I told you this is a 3/4 scale replica of the wall in Washington, D.C. So just like the wall in Washington, D.C., we only have 2 years on this memorial. Up here we have 1959. Down here we have 1975. When we asked for the list of casualties of those who died in this war, they gave us a list of casualties, and they told us that Dale Beese and Chester Ovenand were the first 2 casualties of this war. Now in 1959, remember back to the timeline, what were Beese and Ovenand doing in Vietnam? What was their job? Advisors. You can still have your college credits. Good job. They were advisors. They had finished teaching the South Vietnamese troops that day. They were being billeted in a French farmhouse. They had finished supper. They had taken their chairs and tables and pushed them aside. They were watching a movie being projected up on a white wall. And when they turned on the light switches to change the movie reels, the enemy fired in through the window and killed them both. They both died on the same day. So we alphabetized their names. B comes before O. The next year we lose an airplane. On that airplane we have Pinkowski, Garside, McGee, Matson, Sampson, Whitecamp, and Weston. All 7 of those men die on the same day, so we alphabetize their names. The wall is organized chronologically by their date of death and alphabetically on each day. But just like life, those names flow together. Because no matter how close you look, you're not going to see a designation for a new day. You're not going to see a mark for a new month, no indication of a new year. Because just like life, those names run together, one after another, line after line, panel after panel. This first panel here begins in 1959. This is the first 684 casualties of this war. It goes from 1959 to the spring of 1965. This first panel here is the first 5 years of casualties. Remember, in 1965, we put our troops in. We start fighting this war. We start taking more casualties. We then move on to this next panel. This next panel has 696 casualties. This next panel starts in the late spring of 1965 and comes into the early fall. This panel here is only 5 months of casualties. We then move on to this next panel. This panel is probably the most famous panel on the wall. This is the panel that at the end of the movie We Were Soldiers, Mel Gibson, who plays Colonel Hal Moore, comes to the wall to touch the 146 names of the guys who died in the first major engagement with the NBA in the Ai Drang Valley. 146 men in 3 days. There are 30 lines in the middle of this panel. This panel has more names than any other panel on the wall, 704 names in total, and this panel here is only 5 weeks. 5 years, 5 months, 5 weeks, and 1965 ends right here. 66 runs for 6 or 7 panels. It's then followed by 67. And then where you see that big flag down there by the white sheet, that's January 1st of 1968. Remember when we talked at the timeline about how bad 1968 was? The outside 38 panels on this side is just January 1st through May 17th of 1968. Not even 5 months. It includes one panel that barely covers those 246 casualties the first day of the Tet Offensive. And it's the beginning part of May, which would become the deadliest month. But May continues up back out on that far point. And from that far point to the tall flag on this side, those outside 35 panels is May 17th through December 31st of 1968. 73 of 140 panels for 1 year. The deadliest year of the war, almost 40% of our losses. But then we have 20 panels for 1969, 14 for 1970, 71 follows 70, and then this panel here is the latter part of 72 down to 1975. And those last 21 Americans to die in that Mayaguez rescue are some of the last names on the panel down there. And they're side by side with the first name, showing you that no matter when you died in this war, your death is just as important as everyone else. And you, as the living visitor, connect this circle of sacrifice. Well, that's beautiful, Tim, but how the heck am I ever going to find a name? When you look up a name, you're given two pieces of information. First off, you're given a panel, and secondly, you're given a line. Now, down here on the bottom of these panels, you'll notice we have W2, W3, W4, all the way out to W70. These are the west panels. I know you all think that that's east over there, but we redid the compass this week. That is west this week. Down here at the bottom of these panels, you have E2, E3, E4, all the way out to E70. The east panels, the east panels. Now in Washington, D.C., the east panels point to the Washington Monument. In Washington, D.C., the west panels point to the Lincoln Memorial. The wall is purposely at this 125-degree angle that we replicated here because it points to the Washington and Lincoln Memorials. We hope that we could draw upon the healing that our nation had after the Revolutionary War and Civil War, and we could heal after this war as well. Knowing what panel they're on, you still don't want to have to look amongst 600 names. So the next bit of information you're given is what line they're on. And that's how many lines down from the top that you need to count. Now I'm a blonde. I don't know how to count unless higher than 10 unless I'm wearing sandals. So here on this side, on the justified border, you'll see we have these circles for every 10 lines. So if you're looking for someone who's on 3 East, line 56, you can simply count down 5 of those 10s and then another 6. And then you have 5 or 6 names on that line, and your name is going to be one of the 5 or 6 names. Now the beauty of the wall is the fact it's colorblind. There's no indication what state you're from. Even if you're a foreign national who is fighting an American uniform, your name is on here the same. The wonder of the wall is that it's rankless. The generals are treated exactly like the privates. The admirals are treated exactly like the firemen. Everyone is treated the same. The magic of the wall is that there is no indication of those who received the Medal of Honor and those who came back to a hospital ship and died of malaria. Everyone is treated the same with their first name, their middle initial, and last name. Now there are exceptions for the Hispanic names. There are exceptions for the Southern names because Billy Bob Thornton is not Billy B. Thornton. But everybody is first name, middle initial, and last name. Now some of you all have the audacity to have a last name that looks like a first name or a first name that looks like a last name. So we have to separate the names. We separate the names on the wall with a diamond. So we know where one name ends and another begins. But when we were engraving the panels in 1982, there were a group of people who filed a lawsuit to stop with construction. You see, they wanted to have their loved ones included on the memorial, but they didn't want to have them listed amongst the dead. It was the family and friends of those whose whereabouts were unknown. Because if you were holding out hope that your father was going to come back someday, and you put his name up amongst those who had died, you had to give up some of that hope. But if you didn't get his name on the memorial, how would he get his rightful place amongst those he had served and died beside? And so what we agreed to do in order to suspend the lawsuit and continue with construction is that we would include their names on the date that they had gone missing. And if their whereabouts were unknown, we would put a cross beside their name. Had there ever been any of them returned alive, we were going to put a circle around that cross. None were returned alive after 1982, so there are no circles around any crosses. But now, as we recover their remains, the Department of Defense notifies us once a year in February, and in May we go and superimpose a diamond atop that cross like all the other diamonds. Last year, 2 years ago, they found 4 Americans' remains in Vietnam. And in last May, we changed those 4 status symbols to diamonds at the wall in Washington, D.C., and weeks later at the wall that heals. We'll be notified next month about those that they recovered last year, and we will be doing that and reading their names for the first time on Memorial Day to welcome them home. Our nation will not rest until there's a full accounting of those who are missing, and we will continue to search, and we'll continue to change the wall to reflect that reality. Ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, I'd like you to remind you that never before in our nation's history had we created a memorial in the National Mall to honor and remember everyone from a wartime period. But because of those Vietnam veterans who had that vision, that dream to build this memorial, 6 years later we built a memorial to the Korean War veterans. 10 years after that to the World War II veterans. 100 years after World War I, we put up the World War I memorial. They broke ground 2 months ago on the Persian Gulf Memorial. It should be done in the next year or so, and they're currently in design and fundraising stages for a post 9/11 memorial. Our nation honors service members on the National Mall with memorials. Secondly, I'd like you to recognize the power of a name. For when you have a name, you can tell a story. When you have a name, you can get a picture. And when we can continue to see them and tell their stories, they will live on forever. Several years ago, a young lady came down to the wall and pointed to the last woman's name on the wall, Lieutenant Mary Clinker down here. She was with her 2 daughters. See, Lieutenant Clinker was assigned to the Philippines. And in 1975, we stood up an operation known as Operation Baby Lift. Operation Baby Lift was our effort to get out as many of those orphans that we could and bring them back to the United States to grow up in freedom. She was on the first C-5 that was loaded with over 200 children and 36 adults. And when that plane took off from Tonsanut Air Base, that plane lifted off, and shortly after liftoff, the back door of that plane broke open. They lumbered back around to make a crash landing, and they fell short of the runway. And in the crash, in the rice paddy, over 100 of those children and 24 of those adults were killed, along with Lieutenant Klinker. That young lady who came down to the wall several years ago was there with her daughters. And she pointed to that name and she said, "It's because of her that I got to come to this country. It's because of her that I got to grow up and be free. And it's because of her that we're here today." Because we have names, because we have pictures, we can continue to tell their stories and pass that down from generation to generation. And because you have the wall that heals, that your community has gathered together to bring to your community, you can sit here and come out and learn about the Vietnam War. You can see how this inspired the way that we currently treat our service members and our veterans, and how that was a transformation from the way that we treated them merely 50 years ago. I hope that you'll go back and see some of the things that we skipped past. I hope that you'll come back from some of our other ceremonies and events. I hope that you'll engage with our awesome volunteers who are out here in your orange vests to find names on the wall and to ask them questions and get some more of those answers that we've done. Tonight at 6:12, right as the sun sets, a young man is going to come down here and play taps as sunset. And if you haven't seen this wall at night, it is absolutely magical. It's even more beautiful than a wall in Washington, D.C. And I hope that you'll share with others the opportunity to take a tour, to come on back out and learn about this memorial and this war. But I ask one more thing of you. One more thing. I don't want you to just wait for Veterans Day or any other patriotic holiday. I want you to do this every single day. When you come across someone who is wearing a hat or a shirt, or through conversation you've learned that they're a veteran or a service member, I want you to take 2 seconds out of your day to extend your hand to theirs and thank them for their service. You all have a great day. Thank you very much.